Now, here's the question which everybody's been waiting for. What will happen to the price of silver and other precious metals if gold is revalued to $15,000? Now, what does that mean? Well, for those who understand what the balance sheet is and what the assets are, there's one asset he must be talking about, at least everybody thinks so, and that is the most liquid and the most undervalued asset on the Treasury's balance sheet. And that asset is 261.5 million ounces of gold, which is valued by the Treasury at the statutory price of $42.22. This can't continue indefinitely. It's not possible to continue taking on debt indefinitely without any consequences. We're going to monetize the asset side of the US balance sheet for the American people. Now, what does that mean? Well, for those who understand what the balance sheet is and what the assets are, there's one asset he must be talking about, at least everybody thinks so, and that is the most liquid and the most undervalued asset on the Treasury's balance sheet. And that asset is 261.5 million ounces of gold, which is valued by the Treasury at the statutory price of $42.22. That's a price which was set by law in 1972. So those 261.5 million ounces at $42.22 are worth $11 billion. So the questions everybody's asking, and I'll come back to all these questions shortly, but I'll read the questions out. 1. When will it happen? 2. What will be the new gold price? 3. How will it happen? 4. Will they take my gold, just like they did in 1933? Will they confiscate it? Don't forget, 1934, 1 year after they confiscated people's gold, they raised the price from $20 to $35 an ounce, an increase of 69% in one night. How will it affect the price of silver and other precious metals? Now, that's what you want to hear about, and I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to tell you how I get to my $184 price. Will it cause a collapse in the currency and massive inflation? So I'm going to break these questions down for you one by one. Let's start with the first question. When will it happen? Well, there's not going to be any official warning. Those who are in the know will be sworn to secrecy. However, as is always the case, there will be many people involved in the planning, and the secret is bound to leak out. Someone will tell their partner will tell their dad, the dad will tell his mates at the next barbecue, and so on. And of course, dad's mates are all going to pile into gold. Pretty soon, there'll be a large group of people in the know who were never supposed to know. But you won't know, except you're hearing it here. You won't know when. Your only warning sign will be a rapidly rising gold price without any apparent reason. There'll be no accompanying story. No wars, no surge in inflation, no default. But the question is still when. Well, the button's likely to be pushed when the economy needs a stimulus. Or it could be pushed when some emergency action is needed due to some event, such as a Liz Truss moment. Liz Truss moment in the UK was a bond crisis, a gilts crisis, so it might be a crisis in the US Treasury market. The second question is, what will be the new gold price? Well, we've heard all kinds of figures from the current price of $3,300 all the way up to $150,000. The most popular quoted figure is $20,000 an ounce. I have my reasons to think that's probably going to be a little bit too high. I think the figure will be $15,000 an ounce. It's a guess. I don't have inside information. But $15,000 is about 4.5 times higher than today's price of $3,300. Now, each price has its pros and its cons. But any price, from the present price of 3,300 all the way up to the highest possible figure, is going to create a profit for the Treasury, and it's also going to create a lot of newly printed cash for the Treasury if it's done right, yet allowing the Treasury to keep the gold. And I'm going to describe in a minute how, with a little bit of accounting magic, the Treasury can create trillions of dollars of newly spendable money, which can eliminate the budget deficit for the next 2 years, can reduce government debt, and allow the Treasury to keep its gold. And that absolutely is possible. Now, here's the question which everybody's been waiting for. What will happen to the price of silver and other precious metals if gold is revalued to $15,000? So the gold market is worth $22.87 trillion. That's the circulating supply. The silver market is worth 1/10 of that. It's a very small market compared with gold. It's worth around it's worth $2 trillion, less than 1/10 of the circulating supply of gold. And the platinum market is even smaller. It's almost 1/10 of the size of the silver market at $257 billion. So gold is the big market, silver is 1/10 of that, less than 1/10, and platinum is nearly 1/10 of that. So what would happen to the silver price, and what's the maths? I'm going to look at that for you now. Perhaps just to give you some relative market caps, let's just have a quick look at some other assets which are circulating. So gold has a market cap of 22.87 trillion. Put that in perspective, Nvidia's 4 trillion, Bitcoin's 2 trillion, silver's 2 trillion, platinum is 257 billion, palladium is 214 billion. So the silver market is tiny compared with the gold market, less than 1/10 of the size, and the platinum market's smaller still. So for the sake of this exercise, to work out what the silver price could be literally overnight if gold is revalued. And I'm going to make a few assumptions, and you can make the same assumptions or different assumptions to arrive at your own figure. So let's assume that, first of all, the President revalues gold at $15,000 an ounce, and therefore that means that the Treasury is standing ready to buy gold from all comers at $15,000 an ounce. A really good thing for the Treasury. They get a lot more gold with from effectively newly printed paper. So I think whilst there'll be plenty of people willing to swap their gold for worthless paper, the Treasury will be only too happy to take the valuable gold for paper which it can print like there's no tomorrow via the Federal Reserve. So I'm going to assume that not everybody rushes down to the Treasury to sell their gold at $15,000. For this exercise, I'll assume that 3% of people who hold gold decide to sell it to the Treasury or to someone else at the new price of $15,000 an ounce. Only 3%. And I'm going to assume that when they get that money, half of that money they decide to reinvest in other precious metals, specifically silver in this case. And then you've got to look at how many existing silver sellers will be selling their silver to these people who want to buy it. Well, I'm going to say only 10% of silver holders will be willing to sell. And now let's see how that would affect the silver price. So there's my assumptions on the screen. You can see what I'm assuming. So let's go through this step by step. So you can see on the screen what would happen, and you can see the maths. So assuming that 3% of the gold is sold back to the Treasury at $15,000 an ounce, that would generate for the sellers $2.97 trillion, or let's call it $3 trillion for simplicity, in cash. And we're going to assume that half of that cash will then find its way into the silver market and be invested in silver. And we're assuming that only 10% of the people who own silver will sell some. So what we then do is take the amount of silver ounces which will be sold. You can see the maths on the screen. Take a screenshot if you want to. Amount of silver being sold. We'll take the total cash available divided by the number of ounces of silver which would be sold, and we see that we arrive at a price of $184.50 an ounce. Now, of course, there were three assumptions in there. We're assuming that 3% of the gold is redeemed for $15,000 at the Treasury. We're assuming half the money goes into silver, and we're assuming that only 10% of silver holders decide to sell their silver. Change any of these parameters and you'll get to a different number. But I think that's a good guess at $184.50 per ounce. Now, the last question we've got to ask is, what would happen if they do this exercise? Will it cause a currency collapse? Will there be massive inflation? In my opinion, it's very unlikely. So goods are not priced in gold. Services are not priced in gold. They're priced in dollars. And after all, the gold price has nearly doubled in the last 2 years, and it's had very little effect on the prices at all. The reason prices go up is because the level of government debt and the amount of cash in circulation is rising, and that causes a general rise in retail prices and also causes a general rise in the gold price. But the gold price on its own going up won't cause retail prices to rise. They're not connected. I mean, and we've seen that as evidence. We've seen the gold price has gone up and up and up, but it's been going up because of the extra debt and the extra cash in circulation. It's not been the gold price which has been dragging up retail prices, consumer prices. And let's just put the this into perspective. This exercise would generate $3.9 trillion. To put that in perspective, it's not much more than the annual budget deficit, which will now be a surplus because of what we've done. But the annual budget deficit is about $2 trillion a year, which means the government would normally have to borrow $2 trillion a year to service that deficit. That's money they won't need to borrow, and they'll have surplus out of that 3.9 million. They'll have surplus cash with which to redeem maturing debt over the 6 to 9 months. So we're actually in a situation where government debt is going down. That's actually not the sort of thing which pushes up the price of goods in the shops. Of course, there might be some minor effect because we've effectively got 3.9 trillion of cash coming into the economy. But it's not much different from 3.9 trillion of debt growing anyway. So what have we done in this exercise at the end of the day? Gold certificates, which are not redeemable, pay no interest, and are not part of the national debt. Plus, the government's got 3.9 trillion of cash to spend. They've kept all their gold. It's still where it's never moved. This is going to be terribly stimulative for the economy. It's good for the economy, and it will most likely push up other asset prices like the silver price, but of course equities and so on could rise as well. But it's not really going to affect the retail price or anything like that. I mean, let's just take one last comment. 3.9 trillion being raised is less than the price of one company on the New York Stock Exchange. I'm talking about the company Nvidia, which has got a market capitalization of more than $4 trillion. So it's not a big deal raising 3.9 trillion in cash.
Okay, so you've just heard Clive Thompson walk through how gold revaluation could send silver shooting to $184 an ounce. Now, I know that number sounds outrageous at first, because right now silver is still around the mid-20s. But once you listen to the math and the logic, it's actually not far-fetched at all. The crazy thing is, this isn't just some internet hype story. This is grounded in how the US government actually accounts for its gold, how the Treasury could legally and quietly reprice it, and how silver, being the smaller, hungrier cousin of gold, reacts like gasoline to a match when those flows of money shift. But here's the thing, the story doesn't stop with the Treasury's accounting trick. It ties into America's debt problem, the Federal Reserve's limited options, politics in Washington, and even the bigger chess game between the US and China. And if you zoom out, you start to see silver not as a forgotten relic, but as one of the most explosive pressure valves in the whole financial system. Think about the debt first. America is staring at a mountain of obligations. The national debt is more than $34 trillion, and a huge chunk of that is rolling over in the next few years at higher interest rates than before. That's not an abstract number. It means the government is spending more and more of its budget just to pay interest, not even touching the principal. The Congressional Budget Office already projects that by the end of this decade, the U.S. will spend more on interest payments than on defense, more on servicing old debt than on soldiers, ships, and Medicare combined. That's the definition of unsustainable. And here's the kicker. It's happening at a time when rates are high because inflation is sticky. Jerome Powell and the Fed can't just cut rates to zero like they did in 2008 without risking another inflation surge. So the Fed's hands are tied. The usual playbook, print money, lower rates, kick the can down the road, doesn't work without political blowback or consumer pain. That's why Clive's idea, monetize the asset side of the balance sheet, matters. It sounds fancy, but it boils down to this. The government owns 261 million ounces of gold that it still values at $42 an ounce, a price set in 1972. The real market price is over $3,000. Just changing the number on the books creates trillions of dollars in profit that can be spent without raising taxes or borrowing more. It's a trick Roosevelt used in 1934 when he repriced gold from $20 to $35 overnight. And once you see that, silver's role starts to come into focus. Because if gold is the anchor of the system, silver is the shadow. It reacts faster, moves harder, and because the silver market is tiny compared to gold, even a small flow of money can send it parabolic. Now layer politics on top of this. It's 2025. The US election cycle is roaring again. Trump is either preparing a comeback or heavily shaping Republican policy. Love him or hate him, he's been clear. He prefers a weaker dollar to help U.S. exports and to reshore industry. A weaker dollar is rocket fuel for gold and silver because metals are priced in dollars. And politically, no administration wants to be remembered for presiding over a debt implosion. Revaluing gold, and by extension boosting silver, can be spun as patriotic. Picture the speech. We unlocked America's hidden wealth. We turned our balance sheet into strength. That plays well on the campaign trail, even if the mechanics are just clever accounting. And then you've got China in the background. For years, Beijing has been quietly buying gold, both officially through its central bank and unofficially through state banks. They know the dollar system is fragile. Every ton of gold they stack is a hedge against a dollar-based financial world they don't fully trust. Now imagine Washington suddenly revalues gold to $15,000. Overnight, China's reserves multiply in value. They're sitting on a war chest that rivals the West. That's a strategic gift. But here's the interesting twist. China doesn't dominate silver the way it dominates gold or rare earths. Yes, it uses silver for solar panels and electronics, but it doesn't control the above-ground stockpile. That leaves silver as one of the last commodities where Western investors can actually front-run the big geopolitical players. And silver is not just money. It's an industrial lifeline. This is the part most people overlook. Every solar panel has silver paste. Every electric vehicle has silver contacts. Every 5G tower, every medical device, silver is embedded in the future economy. When you combine that industrial demand with the kind of monetary shock Clive outlined, the result is a double squeeze. It's not just investors bidding up silver because gold got repriced. It's manufacturers and governments scrambling to secure supply because they need it for energy and tech. And remember, the silver market is tiny, around $2 trillion compared to gold's 20+ trillion. That's why Clive's math landed at $184 an ounce with just a few percentage points of gold owners moving into silver. It doesn't take much. People scoff at that number, but Let's check history. In 1980, silver spiked to $50 when the Hunt brothers tried to corner the market. Adjust that for inflation today, and you're already above 180. And that was before solar, before EVs, before a $34 trillion US debt burden. So 184 isn't a wild moonshot. It's what happens when history rhymes with new catalysts. But let's be clear, governments don't revalue gold to make silver stackers rich. They do it because they're cornered by fear of a bond crisis, fear of losing reserve currency status, fear of political collapse if checks stop clearing. Fear is the driver. But once the revaluation is done, greed takes over. CNBC will suddenly rediscover silver. Reddit forums will light up. The same people who laughed at metals investors will scramble to buy in. And by then, the easy gains are gone. That's why this conversation matters now, before the panic headlines. So what does 184 silver mean for everyday Americans? First, your retirement account might look different. Metals ETFs and mining stocks could skyrocket, pulling in passive money and boosting portfolios that were otherwise stagnating. Second, the psychology of the dollar could shift. When people start seeing metals outperform cash, they lose faith in savings accounts and want to spend or invest dollars faster. That's inflationary in itself. Third, there could be political backlash. In the 1930s, the government literally confiscated private gold. I'm not saying silver confiscation is on the table, but don't underestimate Washington's willingness to tax windfalls or regulate physical sales if things get chaotic. And here's a thought that doesn't get enough airtime. If the Treasury can fix its balance sheet with one executive order, what does that say about the Federal Reserve? For over a century, the Fed has been the wizard behind the curtain, pulling levers, printing liquidity, tweaking rates. But if one Treasury Secretary can change the statutory gold price and conjure trillions, suddenly the Fed looks like a middleman. That power shift inside Washington could rattle markets, and whenever power is in question, people turn to hard assets like silver for certainty. Globally, the knock-on effects are huge. Every central bank holding gold has to adjust. Their reserves balloon. Currencies reprice. And silver, being the junior metal, gets dragged along everywhere. Think about billions of households in India and China who already buy silver jewelry and bars as savings. If their silver suddenly doubles or triples in value, that cultural confidence feeds more buying. It becomes a self-reinforcing loop of demand. So when Clive shows the math to 184, don't think of it as an isolated prediction. Think of it as the tip of a bigger iceberg. America's debt trap makes extraordinary measures inevitable. The Fed can't rescue us without destroying the dollar. Politics leans toward weaker dollars and higher asset prices. China is hoarding gold, leaving silver as the last open field for Western investors. Industrial demand is rising no matter what politicians do. Add those layers together and you don't just have a price target. You have a roadmap for how the next financial crisis and the next recovery could play out. If we were just talking as friends, I'd put it this way. You don't need to bet your whole life savings on silver. That would be reckless. But ignoring it completely, that's like living on a fault line and refusing to buy earthquake insurance. Maybe the quake doesn't hit tomorrow or next year. But when it does, the people who prepared even a little will be miles ahead. Because silver isn't just a shiny piece of metal. It's a mirror. It reflects every fear about government debt, every greedy rush into hard assets, every political gamble, every geopolitical rivalry. And right now, that mirror is about to light up brighter than it has in decades.